The sound of the axe biting into it echoed through the dense forest, each strike sending vibrations up my arms. I wiped the sweat from my brow and paused, looking up at the towering oak in front of me. It had stood here for as long as anyone could remember, its thick branches stretching toward the sky like arms pleading with some unseen force. The locals had warned me to leave this tree alone, murmuring about old superstitions and forest spirits. But I had never put much stock in old wives' tales. To me, it was just another tree, albeit a massive one, and it would provide enough lumber to keep us going through the winter. Besides, I'd cleared dozens of trees in my time. This one was no different, no matter what the townsfolk whispered behind my back. So, I swung the axe again and again, until the base of the oak groaned in protest. With one final, decisive blow, the trunk gave way. I stepped back as the tree fell in slow motion, its branches tearing through the canopy of the forest, sending birds scattering into the sky. When it hit the ground, the earth shuddered beneath my feet. For a moment, there was silence, an eerie, unnatural stillness that hung in the air. Then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the leaves. But the more I listened, the more distinct the sounds became. They were voices, low, hushed, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. They circled around me, brushing past my ears like fleeting gusts of air. I spun around, scanning the tree-line, but saw nothing. The forest was empty, just as it had been before. I shook my head, laughing at myself. Exhaustion could do strange things to a man's mind. I gathered my tools and started the long walk back to the cabin, the felled oak lying in the clearing like a fallen giant. The whispers followed me the entire way home. Miriam was waiting for me on the porch when I arrived. She was knitting, the rhythmic click of her needles offering a comforting contrast to the strange unease that had settled over me. Our son, Daniel, played in the dirt by her feet, oblivious to the world around him. "You've been gone a while," she said, her voice soft and steady as always. "You find anything worth the effort?" I dropped my axe by the door and nodded. "Cut down the biggest oak I've ever seen. Should be enough wood to last us a good while." She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "Was it the one by the ridge? The one folks say is cursed?" I chuckled, though it came out a little strained. "You've been listening to too many stories, Miriam. It's just a tree." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she glanced back at Daniel and smiled. "Well, as long as it keeps the fire burning, I suppose I can live with it." That night, as we settled in for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whispers hadn't stopped. I could still hear them faintly in the distance, like an insistent hum just beyond the edge of hearing. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the wind to die down or for sleep to take me. But neither came. In the morning, the forest seemed darker, the air heavier. I could feel something watching me from the shadows of the trees, though I never caught sight of anything. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as though the very earth was protesting the oak's fall. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, a man couldn't afford to be superstitious when he had a family to feed. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger, and the whispers grew louder. One afternoon, while chopping wood from the felled oak, I noticed something strange. The stump, which had been clean-cut just days before, was now covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood as if by some unseen hand. I ran my fingers over the markings, frowning. They hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. The whispers rose around me again, and this time, they weren't content to stay at the edge of my hearing. They pressed in closer, louder, more insistent. I backed away from the stump, the axe slipping from my hand. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled toward the cabin, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't fully grasp. Miriam was inside when I burst through the door, her face pale with worry. She didn't ask what had happened, she could see it in my eyes. That night, as the whispers closed in around us once more, I realized with a sinking dread that the townsfolk might have been right. The oak wasn't just any tree. And whatever had been living within it wasn't happy with me. The first night after the oak fell, I barely slept. The cabin, usually filled with the comforting creaks and groans of settling wood, felt different, like something else had slipped in through the cracks along with the evening wind. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The whispers, they were so faint now, almost like the wind had finally carried them away. But every so often, just as I began to drift off, they would return, a quiet, unsettling murmur, almost like someone was standing just outside the window, speaking in a language that made no sense to me. Morning brought no relief. I forced myself out of bed, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Miriam watched me with quiet concern as I stoked the fire and prepared for another day. She could tell something was wrong, even if I hadn't spoken a word of it yet. "You haven't been sleeping," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I'm fine," I muttered, more to convince myself than her. "Just tired." She didn't press me, though I could tell she wanted to. She always knew when something wasn't right with me, but she also knew when to leave me to wrestle with my own demons. I kissed her on the forehead and stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The forest, once so familiar and steady, felt different now, like it had shifted somehow, becoming darker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to loom taller, their branches twisting in ways that made the shadows dance unnaturally across the ground. I shook my head and tried to push the thoughts away, grabbing my axe and heading toward the pile of timber I'd left near the ridge. As I worked, the whispers returned, just as they had the night before. They circled around me, quiet at first, like they were testing my patience. I gritted my teeth and kept swinging the axe, the rhythmic thud of wood splitting beneath the blade the only thing keeping my mind anchored. But the whispers grew louder, pressing in on me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I stopped, panting, wiping sweat from my brow despite the cold. It was midday, but the sun was barely breaking through the thick canopy above me. The shadows of the trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, their forms growing longer, more twisted. I blinked and looked again, but everything seemed normal. I was just tired, that was all. But then I heard it, a voice, clearer than before. It was closer now, almost as if it was speaking directly into my ear. My heart raced, and I turned quickly, axe in hand, ready to defend myself. But there was no one there. Just the trees, standing silent and still as always. I laughed bitterly at myself, shaking my head. "Losing your mind, Elias," I muttered. "Just the wind. That's all it is." But the wind didn't carve symbols into tree stumps. And it didn't whisper in a language no one had spoken for generations. When I returned to the cabin that evening, Miriam was waiting for me by the fire, her face etched with worry. Daniel sat on the floor by her feet, playing quietly with a few wooden blocks. "You're jumpy," she said, not looking up from her knitting. "Something's not right." I swallowed hard, not wanting to admit that she was right. "It's nothing," I said. "Just a long day." "Elias," she began, her tone firmer now, "don't lie to me." I sighed, sinking into the chair opposite her. I hadn't said a word to her about the voices, about the strange symbols I'd seen on the stump. I'd convinced myself that it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the fear that had been creeping up my spine since the day I cut down that oak was growing stronger, harder to ignore. "There's something in the forest," I said finally. "I don't know what it is, but I've been hearing things. Voices. Whispers. And those markings, they weren't there before." Miriam looked at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might laugh, tell me I was being ridiculous. But she didn't. Instead, she set her knitting aside and crossed the room to stand in front of me. "I've heard them too," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Not as loud as you, but I've heard them." A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I wasn't losing my mind after all. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to leave us alone. The next morning, I rose early, determined to get through the day without letting the whispers consume my thoughts. Miriam's admission that she had heard them too did little to comfort me. In fact, it only deepened the pit of dread growing in my gut. But we had to keep moving, had to keep working. Life wouldn't wait for us to figure out what was happening in those woods. I made my way toward the ridge, where the oak still lay in pieces. The symbols on the stump hadn't changed, but they felt more ominous now, as if they were watching me. I ignored them, focusing on chopping and hauling wood, trying to drown out the whispers that circled like vultures. By noon, I couldn't stand the feeling any longer. It felt like something was breathing down my neck, always just out of sight. I stopped and scanned the tree line, but it was the same as always, silent, still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, watching, waiting. That's when I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. My heart jumped into my throat as I whirled around, axe raised. But it wasn't some phantom from the woods, it was old man Darrow. He stood there, leaning on his walking stick, his thin face creased with deep lines of age. His eyes, however, were sharp, glinting with something I couldn't quite place. He wasn't a man many of the locals took seriously. Most saw him as nothing more than a harmless old hunter who had spent too many years alone in the woods. But in that moment, the way he looked at me made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You've heard them, haven't you?" Darrow asked, his voice low and rough, like gravel being dragged across stone. I narrowed my eyes. "Heard what?" "The whispers," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They've been following you since you cut down that tree, haven't they?" A cold chill crept up my spine. "How did you?" "They're angry," he interrupted. "The spirits. They don't take kindly to their home being disturbed." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was pulling my leg or if he truly believed what he was saying. The words spirits didn't sit well with me, but I couldn't deny that something was wrong in those woods. I lowered the axe slowly, but my guard was still up. "I don't believe in ghost stories, old man," I said, though even I could hear the tremor in my voice. Darrow didn't laugh, didn't argue. He just stared at me with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Neither did I," he said after a long pause. "Not until I came too close to their land myself. I tried to take that oak years ago, thought it would make me a fortune in timber. But they stopped me before I could cut it down. Gave me a warning. Seems you didn't get that courtesy." I didn't know what to say. The whispers, the markings on the stump, Miriam's quiet fear, it all felt connected now, and I didn't like the direction my thoughts were heading. But what could I do? We needed that wood. The spirits, or whatever they were, could go hang themselves for all I cared. "You're saying this is because of the oak?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism in my voice. Darrow nodded slowly. The oak was sacred. To them, at least. Cutting it down stirred something that's been sleeping a long time. His gaze turned darker. "You've got a family, don't you?" The mention of Miriam and Daniel made my chest tighten. I nodded. Darrow leaned in closer. "Then you better listen," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Leave this place. Take your family and go. Once they start whispering, they don't stop." I scoffed, trying to shake off the fear that was creeping into my bones. "I'm not leaving," I said stubbornly. "This is our land now. We worked for it." Darrow stared at me for a long moment, his face hard. Finally, he sighed and stepped back. "I warned you," he muttered before turning to leave. "They'll take what they want in the end." I watched him disappear into the trees, his words echoing in my mind long after he was gone. The weight of his warning hung heavy over me, but I couldn't give in. I wouldn't. Yet, as I returned to the cabin that evening, the whispers seemed louder, more insistent. And deep down, I began to wonder if Darrow was right. That night, the whispers didn't stay at the edge of my hearing. They grew louder, more insistent, almost like a chorus of voices, murmuring just beneath my consciousness. It was as if they had grown bold, no longer satisfied with lurking in the shadows of the forest. They wanted to be heard. I lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. Miriam slept soundly beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful. She hadn't heard them like I had. Not like this. Not so close, not so clear. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself into sleep, but it wouldn't come. The whispers wouldn't let me. They swirled around me, words I couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for me. I covered my ears with my hands, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head now. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my skin slick with sweat. The fire had burned low, the room dimly lit by the dying embers. My throat was dry, my heart hammering against my ribs. I threw the covers off and got out of bed, pacing the room. As I passed by the window, I caught a glimpse of movement outside. I froze, staring out into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the thick blackness of the forest beyond the cabin. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Someone, moving between the trees. I pressed my face to the glass, squinting into the night. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic now. And then I saw her, a shadowy figure, pale and thin, her dress tattered and torn, gliding silently between the trunks of the trees. Her face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel her eyes on me. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. The spirits were no longer content to haunt my thoughts. They had come closer, drawn by the oak's destruction. I rushed to the door, flinging it open, stepping out into the cold night air. The ground was slick with moisture, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I gripped the axe that I kept propped up against the porch, scanning the tree line. "Show yourself!" I shouted into the night, my voice trembling with anger and fear. The whispers answered me, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. The figure moved again, just beyond the reach of the light from the cabin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost taunting. She stepped closer, just enough for me to make out the hollowed features of her face, dark, sunken eyes and skin stretched too tightly over bones. She was a ghost, a specter from a time long past, and she wasn't alone. Other figures began to emerge from the forest, shadows slipping between the trees, watching me with those same hollow eyes. I backed up, retreating toward the door, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The spirits were gathering. They had come to make me pay for what I had done. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind me. "Elias." Miriam stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had seen them too, these figures that should not have been there. I grabbed her hand and pulled her inside, slamming the door behind us. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to do. The spirits were out there, waiting, watching. "They're here," Miriam whispered, her voice shaking. "They're right outside." I nodded, unable to find my voice. We stood there in silence for what felt like hours, listening to the whispers pressing in on us from all sides. They were relentless, like waves crashing against a shoreline, growing louder and louder until I thought my head might split open from the noise. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The air fell deathly still, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. I listened, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the spirits had retreated into the trees once more, leaving us in an eerie silence. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, that they had given up and gone back to wherever they came from. But I knew better. This wasn't the end. They weren't finished with us. They were just biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The next few days passed in a haze of unease. The whispers never fully left, though they remained distant, as if the spirits were watching from the shadows, waiting. The markings on the stump grew more elaborate, more ominous. They looked like warnings, though I couldn't decipher their meaning. Miriam tried to keep things normal, focusing on Daniel and keeping the cabin running, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew that something was coming. Something worse than whispers and shadows. Then one evening, just as the sun began to set, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with a force that made the cabin creak. I stepped outside to secure the shutters, my heart racing as I felt the cold air whip against my skin. As I latched the final window, I glanced toward the ridge, and my stomach dropped. The figures were back, dozens of them now, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with their hollow eyes. The spirits were done waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. The spirits were relentless, and every night, they came closer. The shadows at the edge of the forest felt like they were pressing in, closing the distance between us and whatever fate awaited. We needed help, and I wasn't too proud to admit it anymore. Miriam had been whispering about Father Michael for days now, her suggestion quiet at first but gaining more urgency with each passing night. I had resisted, stubborn as ever, unwilling to believe that the answer lay in some holy man's words. But when I stepped out onto the porch that morning and saw the faint outlines of figures in the mist still lingering around the clearing, I knew we couldn't keep going on like this. By midday, we had packed a few essentials and made the long walk into town, keeping our eyes on the tree line the whole way. Every rustle of the leaves, every shift of a branch sent shivers through me, and I could tell Miriam was just as nervous. Daniel walked quietly between us, his little hand gripping tightly onto Miriam's, unaware of the true danger lurking just beyond the road. Father Michael's church sat at the far end of town, its stone walls sturdy against the backdrop of the encroaching forest. It was a modest place, much like the town itself, simple, quiet, but imbued with a sense of peace that had become foreign to me. We approached the wooden door, and Miriam knocked softly, her knuckles barely making a sound against the old wood. Father Michael opened the door a moment later, his kind eyes widening slightly at the sight of us. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s, his graying hair neatly combed back, a cross hanging around his neck. His expression shifted to one of concern as he ushered us inside. "What brings you here?" he asked gently, leading us to a pew near the front of the chapel. "Is something troubling you?" I wasn't sure where to start. I hadn't told anyone in town about the whispers or the figures in the forest. They all thought I was just another stubborn fool trying to carve a life out of these old woods. But when I met Father Michael's steady gaze, the words began to spill out. "We've been hearing things," I said slowly, my voice thick with exhaustion. "Strange voices. Whispers in the forest. And we've seen figures. Spirits." Father Michael nodded slowly, as if he had heard this story before. "The woods have always been different," he said softly. "There are things out there that don't belong in our world." Miriam squeezed my hand, her grip tight. "Is there anything you can do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To stop them?" Father Michael stood up and paced the length of the chapel, deep in thought. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "There is a ritual," he said, his voice cautious. "An old rite meant to appease restless spirits. It is not something I do lightly, but it may be the only way to bring peace to your home." I wasn't a religious man, but I would have done anything to rid us of these spirits. I nodded, not needing to hear more. "We'll do it. Whatever it takes." Father Michael explained the ritual as we made our way back to the cabin. He carried a small bundle of sacred tools in a leather satchel, candles, incense, a vial of holy water, and an ancient, weathered book filled with words written in Latin. As he spoke, a heavy feeling settled over me. This was no simple prayer or blessing. It was something far older, far more dangerous. When we reached the clearing, the air felt heavier, like it was charged with electricity. The spirits had withdrawn, but I could sense them watching us from the shadows. Father Michael wasted no time. He set up his tools in a circle around the oak stump, lighting the candles and incense, muttering prayers under his breath. Miriam and I stood back with Daniel, keeping our distance as the priest began the ritual. The wind picked up, swirling around us, carrying with it the familiar whispers that had haunted us for weeks. But now, they were louder, angrier. Father Michael sprinkled the holy water over the stump, his voice rising in a chant that grew stronger with each word. The symbols on the wood seemed to writhe and pulse under the moonlight, as if they were alive. I felt the ground beneath my feet tremble, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Then, all at once, the air shifted. The candles flickered and went out, the wind howling as it whipped through the clearing. Father Michael's chanting faltered for just a moment, and in that brief pause, something snapped. A deafening crack echoed through the forest as the stump split open, a jagged fissure appearing where the tree had once stood. The earth around it seemed to heave, like something was trying to claw its way up from the depths below. Father Michael staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. "The spirits, they're not appeased," he whispered, his voice trembling. The ground beneath the stump surged upward, and from the dark soil emerged the figure of the pale woman I had seen before, her hollow eyes burning with fury. Behind her, more figures began to rise from the earth, their forms twisted and grotesque, their faces contorted with rage. Father Michael grabbed the vial of holy water and threw it at the woman, but she barely flinched. Instead, she let out a low, mournful wail that sent a wave of cold terror crashing over us. The other spirits joined her, their whispers rising into a cacophony of anger and pain. Miriam screamed, pulling Daniel close as we backed away toward the cabin. Father Michael tried to finish the ritual, but it was too late. The spirits had been awakened, and they were beyond anything we could control. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing Miriam's arm. "Now!" We turned and ran toward the cabin, the wails of the spirits echoing behind us, louder than ever before. The ritual had failed, and the spirits were out for vengeance. We barely made it back into the cabin before the door slammed shut behind us, rattling on its hinges. The wails of the spirits outside echoed through the walls, their voices a twisted mix of anger and grief. Miriam held Daniel close, rocking him back and forth as he cried into her shoulder. I was pacing, my heart still pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Father Michael sat slumped in a chair by the fire, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched his rosary. His eyes were distant, like he had seen something no man should ever see. The ritual had failed, and now the spirits were free, more powerful than before. "We can't stay here," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "We need to leave. Tonight." Miriam looked up at me, her face filled with fear and exhaustion. "Where will we go, Elias?" "They'll follow us. You saw what they're capable of." "I don't care," I snapped, frustration and fear mingling in my voice. "We can't stay here. We'll find somewhere else, somewhere they can't reach us." But even as I said the words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The spirits had been tied to that oak for generations, and by cutting it down, I had set them free. They wouldn't stop until they had their revenge. Before I could say anything else, there was a loud knock on the door. My heart leaped into my throat, and I grabbed the axe leaning against the wall. Father Michael rose slowly to his feet, his face grim. "Who would be out there at a time like this?" Miriam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I moved toward the door cautiously, axe in hand, ready for whatever might be on the other side. With a quick motion, I pulled it open, half expecting to see one of the spirits waiting for me. But instead, old man Darrow stood there, his grizzled face creased with an unsettling calm. "Elias," he said, nodding slightly, "I thought I'd find you here." "Darrow," I replied, my grip on the axe tightening. "What are you doing here?" Darrow's eyes flickered over my shoulder, taking in the scene behind me, Miriam clutching Daniel, Father Michael standing by the fire, his face pale and drawn. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind him as he spoke. "You need help," he said simply. "Help?" I spat the word, anger rising in my chest. "You told me to leave. You said there was nothing that could be done." Darrow shrugged, his expression unreadable. "That was before. Now things have changed. The spirits are out, and they won't be satisfied until they get what they want." "What do they want?" Miriam asked, her voice trembling. "Balance," Darrow replied, his eyes dark. "They want balance restored. You took something from them when you cut down that oak, and now they'll take something from you." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Darrow's words sent a chill through me, but there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. He wasn't here to help us, at least, not in the way he claimed. Father Michael stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "What are you suggesting, Darrow?" Darrow turned to face the priest, his gaze cold and calculating. "There's a way to appease them," he said. "But it's not without cost." I didn't like the sound of that. I could feel the tension in the room rise, Miriam's fear palpable as she held Daniel tighter. Father Michael glanced at me, his brow furrowed in concern. "What cost?" I asked warily. Darrow took a step closer to me, his voice low and filled with an edge of menace. "A sacrifice," he said. "You give them what they want, and they'll leave you alone." My blood ran cold. "What kind of sacrifice?" Darrow's eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly, I understood. He didn't need to say it, his intentions were clear in the way he stood there, calm and calculating. He was going to offer me to the spirits. "They want the one who disturbed them," Darrow said, his voice dark. "You cut down that tree. You brought this upon us. It's your life they want." The room fell silent, the air heavy with dread. Miriam gasped, stepping back as the realization hit her. Father Michael stood frozen in place, his rosary clenched tightly in his hand. "You can't be serious," I whispered, anger and fear bubbling inside me. You think offering me to them will make this right? Darrow shrugged. It's the only way. Before I could react, Darrow lunged at me. I swung the axe instinctively, but he was faster than I expected, knocking it from my hand. We struggled, my fists colliding with his wiry frame, but he was stronger than he looked. I could feel his hands closing around my throat, squeezing tighter as the room spun around me. Just as I felt myself fading, Father Michael intervened, pulling Darrow off me and shoving him to the ground. The old man scrambled to his feet, but Father Michael stood between us, his face a mix of fear and determination. You won't touch him, Father Michael said, his voice firm. We'll find another way. Darrow glared at him, his eyes filled with malice. You're making a mistake, Father, he spat before turning and storming out of the cabin. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my hands shaking. Miriam rushed to my side, her face pale with fear. Father Michael knelt beside us, his brow furrowed with worry. We need to be careful, he said quietly. Darrow won't stop until he gets what he wants. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. The spirits were dangerous enough, but now we had another enemy to worry about, one who was all too human. The wind howled outside the cabin, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, my mind racing. Darrow had revealed himself as more dangerous than I had anticipated, willing to offer me up as a sacrifice to the spirits. But the spirits weren't after just my life. They wanted more than that. They wanted their land restored, their balance preserved. Father Michael had been sitting quietly by the door, deep in thought, ever since Darrow left. Miriam hadn't let go of Daniel, keeping him close, whispering soothing words into his ear to keep him calm. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. None of us spoke, as though we were afraid that even the slightest sound would draw the spirits nearer. Finally, Father Michael stood and approached me. His face was pale, his eyes sunken with exhaustion, but there was a determination in his voice that I hadn't heard before. We need to face them, Elias, he said. They won't stop until they've taken what they want. We can't hide from this. I nodded, though my chest tightened with fear. The idea of confronting the spirits terrified me, but he was right. We couldn't keep running. They would haunt us to the ends of the earth if we didn't do something. What do we do? Miriam asked, her voice shaky. How do we stop them? Father Michael turned to her, his expression grave. The spirits need restitution. We have to return something to the land, something of great value. It may be the only way to appease them. I frowned. We have nothing to offer them. We're barely scraping by as it is. Father Michael shook his head. It's not about material wealth. The spirits are tied to the land, to that oak tree. The balance they seek is spiritual. We need to offer them a part of ourselves. I felt a chill run down my spine. The words weighed heavily in the room, thick with implication. Father Michael didn't have to say it outright, but I knew what he was asking. The only way to restore the balance was through sacrifice, whether it was my life or something just as dear. What kind of sacrifice? Miriam asked, her voice quiet, though I could hear the tremor in it. Father Michael hesitated for a moment, then spoke carefully. It must be a willing offering. One of us must face the spirits and offer ourselves to them, our very essence, our life, if necessary. It may not mean death, but it will require us to give up something irreplaceable. It could be a life, a soul, or something deeply personal. The words hung in the air. A cold dread gripped my heart as I realized that I might have no choice. If I didn't do this, if I didn't make this offering, the spirits would take more than just me. They would come for Miriam, for Daniel. I couldn't let that happen. I'll do it, I said before anyone else could speak. The room went silent. Miriam gasped, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She started to shake her head, but I cut her off. It has to be me, Miriam. This is my fault. I cut down that tree. I disturbed their peace. I have to make it right. Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched Daniel tighter, but she didn't argue. She knew I was right. Father Michael nodded solemnly. Then we must prepare. The spirits will come for you, Elias, and you must be ready to face them. We spent the next few hours in silence, making the necessary preparations. Father Michael performed a series of rituals, using the last of his holy water to create protective wards around the cabin. He drew symbols on the doorposts, on the windowsills, and around the hearth. The smell of incense filled the air, thick and heady, mixing with the scent of burning wood. When everything was ready, we stepped outside into the clearing. The night had fallen fully now, the moon high and full in the sky. The wind had died down, leaving the air heavy and still. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting. I stood in the middle of the clearing, gripping the axe tightly in my hand, though I knew it would be useless against what was coming. Father Michael stood beside me, muttering prayers under his breath, his hands trembling as he clutched his rosary. Miriam and Daniel stayed back by the cabin, watching from a distance, their faces pale with fear. Then the whispers began. They started as faint murmurs, drifting through the trees like a cold breeze. But they grew louder, closer, until they were all around us, filling the air with an ominous, otherworldly sound. The first figure emerged from the shadows, just beyond the edge of the clearing. The pale woman with hollow eyes, her form twisted and unnatural, glided toward me. Behind her, more spirits appeared, dozens of them, their faces contorted with rage and sorrow. They circled around us, their whispers rising into a cacophony of sound that made my head pound. I stepped forward, my heart racing, and raised my hands in surrender. "I'm here," I called out, my voice trembling. "I'm ready to make this right." The spirits surged toward me, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. The pale woman reached out with her skeletal hand, her eyes burning with fury. I braced myself, preparing for the worst. But instead of pain, a strange calm washed over me. The spirits surrounded me, their whispers growing softer, more mournful. I felt a pull deep within my chest, as if something was being drawn out of me, a piece of my soul, perhaps. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the spirits began to retreat. The pale woman gazed at me one last time before fading into the night, her form dissipating like mist in the wind. The others followed, their presence slowly fading from the clearing until only the silence of the forest remained. It was over. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, feeling drained, hollow. But I was alive. The spirits had accepted my offering, and they were gone. Miriam ran to me, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside me, pulling me into her arms. Father Michael stood over us, his face pale but relieved. The night was quiet again, the balance restored. For now. The silence that followed the departure of the spirits was almost unbearable. The air felt too still, too quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the uneasy peace. My knees sank into the damp earth, and my body felt heavier than it ever had before, weighed down by the exhaustion of what had just transpired. Miriam's arms tightened around me, her sobs muffled against my shoulder, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to lean into her, feeling the warmth of her embrace. But I couldn't relax. Not yet. Father Michael stood a few feet away, his hands still clasped in prayer, his lips moving soundlessly as he finished the last of his rites. His face was gaunt, and I could see the weight of the night in the deep lines etched across his brow. He looked like a man who had just barely escaped with his life, and perhaps he had. The spirits were gone, but their presence lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to fully dissipate. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice rough from the strain of the night. "This place, it's not safe anymore." Miriam pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face full of concern. "Elias, you can barely stand," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to rest. Just for a moment." I shook my head, though even the movement made me dizzy. "We don't have time. They're gone now, but I don't know how long it'll last. We have to leave, Miriam. We can't stay here." Father Michael stepped forward, his eyes meeting mine with a solemn nod. "He's right," he said quietly. "The spirits have been appeased, but the balance is fragile. This land is no longer ours. If we stay, they could return." I knew he was right, but hearing the words spoken aloud sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The land that had once felt like our future now felt like a grave. The spirits had been tied to this place long before we ever set foot here, and they wouldn't let it go so easily. We had trespassed, and though we had made our peace, it was clear we were no longer welcome. With great effort, I forced myself to my feet, wincing as a sharp pain shot through my chest. I still felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away when the spirits had accepted my offering. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was something deeper, something spiritual. I had given up more than I could understand, and I wasn't sure I'd ever fully recover from it. "Let's gather what we can," I said, my voice stronger now despite the ache in my bones. "We don't need much. Just enough to get us through the night. We'll leave at first light." Miriam nodded, her expression resolute, though I could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. She turned and went back into the cabin, quickly gathering up a few supplies, blankets, food, water, whatever we could carry. Daniel clung to her side, his small hands gripping her dress, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. He was too young to fully understand what had happened, but he could sense the danger. He didn't need to know the details, he just needed to know that we were leaving, and we were never coming back. Father Michael helped me gather what little I could manage, his movements slow and deliberate. He was just as worn out as I was, but he never complained. He had been through more than any of us, carrying the weight of the spirits and their ancient wrath on his shoulders. Yet he stood tall, his faith unshaken, his resolve strong. By the time we finished, the sky had begun to lighten, the first faint hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. The forest was still, the whispers gone, but the tension remained thick in the air. We had made it through the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were watching us from the shadows, waiting to reclaim what was theirs. We packed what little we had onto the old wagon hitched to our lone horse, the creaking of the wheels breaking the heavy silence. Miriam climbed up with Daniel, wrapping him in one of the blankets to keep him warm against the morning chill. Father Michael and I took our places at the reins, guiding the horse forward slowly, cautiously. As we left the clearing, I glanced back one last time at the stump where the great oak had once stood. The ground was still raw, the earth torn and broken, the symbols on the stump glowing faintly in the pale light of dawn. It was a reminder of the power that had been unleashed, a power we could never hope to fully understand. The path ahead was narrow and winding, the trees closing in around us as we made our way through the forest. The road back to town felt longer than I remembered, each mile stretching out before us as though the land itself was resisting our departure. But we pressed on, driven by the need to leave this cursed place behind. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the road, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. We had survived, but at what cost? The land that we had worked so hard to claim had turned against us, and the spirits had made it clear that we could never return. The future that I had once envisioned for my family was gone, replaced by an uncertain path that stretched out before us like the road we traveled. I looked over at Miriam, her face weary but determined, and at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in her arms. Father Michael sat beside me, silent in his prayers, his eyes closed as he whispered words of faith into the cool morning air. We had escaped, but we hadn't won. The spirits had let us go, but I knew in my heart that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where the past would never truly be buried, and the spirits of the land would continue to haunt us in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. We had made our narrow escape, but the shadows of the whispering oak would follow us for the rest of our days. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but we pressed forward, leaving behind the clearing and the horrors of the past. The forest began to thin as we neared the outskirts of Bitterroot, and for the first time in days, the whispers faded into the background, replaced by the sounds of the waking world, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze, the creak of the wagon as it rolled slowly down the dirt path. Yet even as the landscape changed, the weight of what had happened clung to us like a shadow. We had survived the night, but the spirits were still out there, watching, waiting. The land we had tried to claim wasn't ours to take, and it never would be. It belonged to the spirits, to the ancient forces that lived deep within the earth and trees. And though they had let us go, I knew we hadn't escaped entirely. We never would. As we passed through the last stretch of forest, I cast one final glance over my shoulder. In the distance, barely visible through the thick trunks of the trees, I saw the faint outline of the clearing where the oak had once stood. The stump was barely a speck now, but in my mind's eye, I could still see it clearly, the twisted symbols, the raw earth, the pale figures watching from the shadows. They were still there. And they always would be. The town of Bitterroot came into view, a quiet, sleepy place just beginning to wake. As we crossed into its boundaries, I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. We were safe here, for now. But the spirits of the Whispering Oak would remain in the forest, waiting for the next to disturb their slumber.
If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.